In this lecture, we're going to talk about two of Nietzsche's works which have helped to give him the reputation of being an immoralist. They're entitled Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morals. What we'll be pointing out is that despite the obviously immoralist ring of these titles, that what Nietzsche is targeting in them is actually a particular type of morality, one that he views as particularly unhealthy in its modern manifestations, but that part of his analysis of origins of morality is an indication that even what is now sick might at one time have served really important psychological purposes. The first work in which he talks about the notion of master and slave morality, a kind of basic dichotomy that he uses to describe different types of moralities, is Beyond Good and Evil. There he characterizes two basic types of morality on the basis of the political context in which they originated. For example, some people are in positions of power, and those people are able to look at the world in a very different way than those who are not. Master morality, as he describes it here, is the kind of morality that grows up among those who really don't have anyone to answer to, who are able to more or less be masters of themselves as well as other people. So master morality on this account is a kind of morality that basically asserts itself in the world. It can manifest will to power without any kind of interference from those who are outside of this particular class. In most societies, however, those who are able to do as they please in this way are a pretty small group of people. By contrast, perhaps a larger segment of society are those who have to answer for their various behaviors, and particularly salient among this group are people who are literally enslaved. Slaves are not in a position to do what they want to do. If they were, they wouldn't be slaves. They wouldn't wait on those that they have to wait on. Indeed, in most cases, people have become slaves by virtue of being captured and their way of life more or less destroyed. The kind of morality that develops among people who are in that position is not one that has anything to do with self-assertion, or at least not direct self-assertion. Instead, it's much more a matter of how to live in a way that's going to create the least problem for yourself. Generally speaking, direct self-assertion is not going to be valued very highly because that sort of thing only gets one in trouble. Instead, slave morality on this account is much more a morality that Nietzsche associates with weakness, a position of political weakness, in fact. A slave, for example, would tend to avoid directly confronting someone in charge, a master, though perhaps the slave might harbor quite a bit of resentment on the sly, and indeed might, among other slaves, end up criticizing the master fairly harshly. But this would have to be something that was kept under wraps. Direct challenges would not be particularly approved of. So what Nietzsche sees slave morality as having amounted to was a kind of way of life geared to lack of perturbance, a way of getting through pretty easily, a way of avoiding any kind of posture that would challenge the masters, and indeed a kind of way of satisfying some sense of self-regard or self-esteem without any kind of external challenging or threatening behavior. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he further develops his analysis, not only focusing on this kind of external political origin, although that's an important part of it, but talking a little bit more in detail about what kinds of evaluations masters and slaves make. It becomes a bit more psychological than it is in his account in Beyond Good and Evil. On the whole, Nietzsche does intend, I think, for this model to be seen as a kind of psychological model. He comments at one point that it's quite possible for a single individual to have partially a master morality and partially a slave morality at war within their own soul. So he wants this to be something that we can, in a sense, internalize or reflect upon how much these models might, in a way, still affect our own behavior, even though presumably none of us are in the position of ancient masters or ancient slaves. However, he does think that there is a kind of historical background to all of this that more or less follows the kind of fairly simplistic model he gives. He considers, for instance, how the ancient Hebrews, after a certain point of time, where they were in a sense their own masters, became enslaved. Very clearly, if one reads the Hebrew Bible, this was a situation that a whole people had to deal with. They had to deal with the fact that their former ways of expressing themselves were now viewed as problematic to the state. They had to deal with the fact that they were under the thumb of people who didn't share their religious presuppositions. And the kind of way that they guarded their identity under these circumstances, Nietzsche concludes, was to adopt a certain kind of slave morality, one that's always, in a sense, looking over one's shoulders, but nevertheless asserting oneself on the sly. Similarly, he thinks that those people who were attracted to Christianity initially tended not to be the people that were in charge. It was several centuries into Christian history before a Roman emperor converted, for example. Instead, this was a religion that appealed mostly to underdogs, people who were not in charge, people who were in fact literal slaves under the Roman regime. And for them, again, a kind of morality that appealed to the idea of not threatening people externally, but challenging them only in your own assessment of yourself internally, was a very appealing and workable kind of view to have. So despite the fact that very literally and obviously Christians were persecuted at times in the Roman Empire, Nietzsche thought that at least the morality that Christianity involved was not overtly as challenging as might have been some of the alternatives, and that for many periods of time, people who were in positions of being oppressed gained some kind of self-esteem through Christianity without necessarily challenging the powers that be.
Several lectures ago, we introduced what might be taken as a premise of Nietzsche's moral psychology, the seemingly simple and obvious idea that people do what they want to do. We've tried to make that clear and make it good in a number of different ways. For example, a few lectures ago, Kathy talked about the problem of asceticism, people denying themselves. They want to eat, and they don't. They want to excel, but they hold themselves back. They want wealth, but they deny themselves wealth. Or, in the extreme form, say Thomas of Becket, they give all of their wealth away. Why do people do such a thing? Because it seems to be that they're not doing what they want. And this is something that has to be explained. And the answer, as Kathy put forward, is that they were really doing what they wanted to do, namely they're exercising their power, or they're gaining a feeling of self-righteousness. Or, more easily to put, they were simply delaying gratification or preventing some future harm. So asceticism can be explained not by rejecting, but rather by appealing to the principle that people do what they want to do. Now, an easy way to understand what master morality is all about is it simply takes this premise as straightforward. People do what they want to do. Now, of course, there are all different levels of desires. There are very vulgar desires, but there are also very sophisticated and refined desires. And part of being a master, or to use the word that Nietzsche actually favors and uses much more, part of being noble is not a matter of not doing what you want to do, but to the contrary, making sure that what you want to do is itself noble and refined. So we might think of Don Juan as somebody who does what he wants to do, but the result is not only harmful to other people, but it turns him into a kind of creep. On the other hand, if you think of someone like Mozart, and I'm not talking about his under-the-piano activities, but rather his at-the-piano activities, Mozart, what he wants to do is to compose the perfect piece of music. And so doing what he wants to do, in fact, is doing something that we all want as well. And the consequence of the masters, as Nietzsche puts it, doing what they want to do is to make the entire society more excellent. Now, the masters tend to be individuals. In history, of course, one isn't entirely clear about this, but if you think about the aristocracy, about the ruling class in most states, and certainly the ruling aristocracy as depicted, say, in Homer's Iliad, when you have people like Agamemnon and Menelaus, even though they're brothers and they're related and all that, they're still always very much individuals and kind of semi at war with one another. But they're very independent people. And the Roman Empire, which Nietzsche perhaps admired more than he should have, You think of all those Roman emperors who hardly had a good deal of family feeling. Well, they were all, in a very straightforward way, out for themselves, and consequently murderous as a result. And the Renaissance, which Nietzsche also admires. If you look at, for example, some of Stendhal's reports of goings-on in the Italian Renaissance, one is shocked by the kind of independence, ruthless and brutal independence, that you find in the masters. But the idea of individuality here is something that, again, is subject to refinement. And, of course, when Nietzsche talks about higher types, he's not talking about the monsters of ancient Rome. He's not talking about the monsters of the Renaissance, even though in one notorious comment he does mention Caesar Borgia, not to praise him, but rather to contrast him and say he'd prefer even a Caesar Borgia to one of the slave types that he wants to put down. But the idea is that the higher type is someone more like Goethe, one of the people he certainly most admires and most frequently mentions in this regard, or artists like Beethoven, Mozart, I presume, other great writers. He wasn't so much involved with painting, but one can imagine any number of, say, Romantic and classical artists that might come to mind. In general, what Nietzsche is referring to by doing what you want to do is something that is very refined. And he has by no means praise for anyone doing what they want to do. After all, how could anyone not do what they want to do? That's the premise. But rather, there are certain ways of desiring, and there are certain kinds of ambitions, there are certain kinds of drives that are more noble and better than others. And for the master, what simply drives his or her behavior is the idea of doing what he or she wants, where what he or she wants is ideally to be conceived of as being the best, and being the best as a person, being the best as a citizen, being the best as an artist, being the best as a warrior, or whatever. The truth is that when Nietzsche talks about master morality, one might say there isn't all that much to talk about, because if morality simply consists of doing what you want to do, and what you want to do should be as virtuous, as excellent as possible, and if we're talking about individuals who have different talents and consequently different virtues, different excellences, there's very little by way of a positive ethics or a positive morality with a small m that one can provide. And that's why Nietzsche often says in many of his works, just not, I'm going to tell you what to do, but quite to the contrary. He says, find your own way. Zarathustra in a famous passage says, don't follow me, find your own way. There's an etymology behind this as well. Just as Kathy said that one finds the origins of slave morality, not in the days when, for example, Israel was a mighty nation. King Solomon, no doubt, was just as much of a tyrant, did just as many awful things as the leaders of other great civilizations of the ancient world. But it's when the Hebrews were in exile, when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, that's where what we call morality with a capital M starts its origins. Or in the early Christian days when Christians were by no means the rulers in Rome, but they were being persecuted right and left and so on. That's where it comes from. So slave morality has to be conceived of as a kind of reaction. And Kathy will talk more about that in a moment. A reaction to master morality in particular. The idea of people who can just do what they want. In fact, the very word good, Nietzsche suggests, comes from an ancient root, which basically means warrior. And it has to do with a kind of what Aristotle, not the later Christians, would call pride, a sense of being great-souled, a sense of self-confidence, or these days, I suppose we might say, very high self-esteem. The model of excellence, I mean, what could it be except oneself? This is what people should be. In the very funny play, a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. There's a very obnoxious Roman general there who sings a song which goes, basically, I am my own ideal. That is master morality. It's not taking instructions from outside, even if, of course, masters are going to be part of a possibly very long tradition. It's not going to be taking instructions from God, and it's certainly not going to be simply obeying a set of prohibitions. But rather, It's going to be pursuing a sense of excellence which is very much one's own, and that's what the word good means. By contrast, the word bad is its opposite. Bad refers to failure. Bad refers to weakness. Bad refers to pathos, what's pathetic. Bad refers to what's vulgar, what's low class, what is not the best, what is unsatisfying. So you might look at the difference between master and slave morality here, both of them following the basic premise of human behavior. People do what they want to do. The difference is masters accept that, follow it straightforwardly, and their ideal is to simply to be the best that they can be. Whereas those who are not masters, those who are slaves, follow the opposite premise. Don't do what you want to do. Don't try to do what you want to do, because you'll only be frustrated. So what they want to do, in a way, is to compensate for that inability to do what they really want to do, and slave morality comes from that.
One of the rather interesting features of Nietzsche's use of the expression good and evil is that he thinks that very dichotomy is a matter that's born of slave morality. If you think about the situation Bob just described, the master doesn't question anything about his or her, usually his, situation. The master is simply filled with self-assertion. There's no reason to question that the way they live is good. On the other hand, for people that became enslaved, there was certainly a reason to doubt their own status. They didn't have any external political status. And if you think about the way the ancient Hebrews dealt with the situation, there are many aspects of the Hebrew Bible, many discussions about what have we done wrong? How could this have happened to us? It led to a great deal of self-questioning. Nietzsche thinks in that context, actually, what the slaves did in developing slave morality was a step in the right psychological direction. He comments, "The slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values." Now, what does this mean? Well, first of all, what it means is that the slaves developed their morality by virtue of being resentful. Pretty obvious who they'd resent. They resent the people who have enslaved them. They resent the masters, who can go around being obnoxious as they feel like without even questioning it themselves. And the slave revolt in morals comes when they make that observation. The way the masters are isn't good in itself. In fact, it isn't even very self-controlled. The way the masters are, what the masters assert to be good, the slaves come to view with skepticism. In fact, they end up concluding that it's evil. Even were they in the position of the masters, they imagine, they wouldn't want to act that way. The way the masters behave is not something to admire. Indeed, it's something to despise. And if that's the case, what are they by contrast? Well, as slaves, they're certainly not acting like the masters. And by contrast with this sense that the masters are evil, they can view themselves as good. But notice, this is exactly the reverse of the way the masters evaluate things. The masters see themselves as good without question. Therefore, they see people who are different from them, probably the slaves most obviously, as bad. So Nietzsche views the dichotomy good and bad as something that goes with master evaluations, whereas good and evil comes from the position of the slaves evaluating as slaves. And they reverse who's good. The masters view themselves as good without question. The slaves have to conclude that they're good. They're already in a position of questioning their status, their own morality. And they have to conclude that they're good only on the basis of having seen someone else as worse than themselves. And in this case, it's the masters that they view this way. So what good amounts to, from their point of view, is not asserting yourself in the kind of direct way that the masters do. It involves having more self-control. Of course, their political position almost ensures that they will have developed some ability in this regard. They view the masters as people who haven't learned these kinds of traits, who haven't learned to be so clever, who haven't learned to be devious, who haven't learned to internally disrespect what externally they might go along with. And that kind of internal move on the part of the slaves, Nietzsche views as a kind of brilliant bit of psychology. The problem is, it later ends up becoming a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that always puts the slave in a kind of secondary position. There is no immediate sense of self-worth without there first having to be a view that someone else is evil.
One can think of this, and let's give it a name, transvaluation of values, a term which Nietzsche uses actually quite frequently. At one point late in his career, was thinking of writing a whole multi-volume series with that as a title. The transvaluation of values might be put in terms of a simple list, that for the masters, the primary sense is good. That good refers to who they are and what they do. Bad is a secondary term. It refers to they're not getting what they want, to their being dissatisfied, or worse. It refers to those people who are so pathetic that they actually never get what they want. The slaves, on the other hand, take what the masters think of as good, and that is evil. It is the primary term. And what's particularly interesting here, as Kathy said, is that good then becomes the derivative term. It becomes the end of an inference. That evil is doing what those guys do that they consider good, whereas what's good for the slaves is not doing all that. So you can think of any number of occasions. For example, wealth has always been thought of in the whole history of humanity since the discovery of valuable things. It's always been thought of as something desirable, and people have always wanted wealth. But then here comes Christianity, and what does it tell you? It's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. In other words, wealth is evil. Money, we're told, is the root of all evil. Or, to appeal to a different sense, strength, power, warrior virtues are what the masters have. It's how they remain masters. And consequently, in Christianity, meekness becomes a virtue. Now, of course, this is tied to a theological promise, namely, the meek shall inherit the earth. But again, you can see this sort of flip of evaluation, so that what was good for the masters now becomes evil according to the slaves. And one might even think in terms of knowledge, although this is a more contemporary notion. But if education, knowledge is something that's good, something to be pursued for its own sake, or pursued because it makes you a more excellent person, then ignorance is bliss, or simple faith is the ideal. There's a sense, though, in which all this leaves something unanswered. If there are two moralities, and if there were master moralities, and of course we still see master morality at work, even, for example, within the Christian religion, if you think of the history of the Catholic Church, I mean, the most powerful person on earth for many generations was the Pope. Now, on the one hand, he was more powerful than even the most powerful of the Roman emperors. At the same time, he was a Christian. And here's that internal mix we were talking about being both master and slave in the same soul. One imagines what it's like to be a pope, and I'm talking about a devout pope rather than a corrupt pope, but what it's like to be a pope and really believe all the language of slave morality, and at the same time be the most powerful person on earth and be able to do anything you want to do. It would be a very complicated situation. The question is, how did we get to the point where slave morality is simply morality with a capital M? The date one can provide, Kathy mentioned it, would be in basically the 330s AD. It's when Constantine converted himself and the Roman emperor, when Constantine converted both himself and the Roman Empire and actually moved the capital for a while. But more interesting is the mechanism. And while in history the mechanism must have been very complicated, I think the basic strategy can be illustrated in a particularly crude example I sometimes use with my students. We've been emphasizing how what Nietzsche always insists on is naturalistic explanations, which means that we are animals and we should understand ourselves in just that way. So let's use an animal account and talk about how a transformation of this sort might have taken place. Imagine a baboon colony. And if you visit a zoo, you'll see very quickly that the baboons quickly rank themselves in a certain order. At the top of the ranking is always the alpha male. Males among the baboons are much bigger than the females, and also older males tend to be larger and tougher and smarter than the younger males. So you have this ranking where the male baboon does basically whatever he wants. If there's a favored spot in the baboon island, let's say a swing with a tire on it, he takes over and swings whenever he feels like it. And if another baboon is already there, they'll scatter. When the food comes, if he's hungry, he just plows right in and takes it. And the others have to wait their turn. And in general, if he wants to mount, he mounts. If he wants to run, he runs. If he wants to throw things, he throws things. Now, one can imagine slightly intelligent, articulate baboons. Among the beta males and the females, a certain amount of resentment starts building up. Why does he get to do whatever he wants to do and we have to wait in line, or we get mounted without our say-so? And so they invent a story. It can't be that when they get together they could beat up the alpha male. If they could have done that, things would have changed a long time ago. They can't. And so they invent a story, and it goes like this. There's a new zookeeper. And this zookeeper has particular contempt for alpha males. He doesn't like the way they do whatever it is they want to do. And when the zookeeper, who is to be distinguished from the ordinary bloke who comes and delivers the food every day, when the zookeeper finally comes to visit the colony, he is going to make short work of the alpha male. Unless, of course, the alpha male changes his ways. Now, one can imagine that if the alpha male were to hear this story over and over again, over the months or years, he might start to worry. He might start to worry that the zookeeper might actually come, and if all the other apes are right, then he's going to be in big trouble. So he may, like one of the medieval popes, find himself both in a position of absolute power and at the same time filled with a kind of self-constraint, trying to tie himself down and make himself no different from the others. It's a phenomenon that Nietzsche calls bad conscience, and it's something that one often finds, even in us. It's that twist between master morality and slave morality within each of us. And eventually, we can imagine the alpha male actually giving in and stating and acting as if he is just another ape. If that's so, then we can see here's how slave morality becomes the morality. It is accepted not just by the slaves, the lower people themselves, but it is accepted by everyone. Now, in terms of what we talked about before, one can easily appreciate how master morality really lends itself to a kind of virtue ethics analysis. We can also understand how slave morality lends itself, to the contrary, to a kind of Kantian Judeo-Christian analysis. Namely, that ethics is universal. The rules are externally imposed, or at least they're externally sanctioned, and they apply in just the same way to everyone.
One of the things we should notice here is that Nietzsche seems to be, in a way, vilifying slave morality. And I think that that's right, even though originally he thinks that it was a good move on the part of the slaves, and, importantly, an expression of their will to power. Being slaves, they had no choice but to want to express themselves in some way, and they did it the best they could. He currently criticizes the type of Christian morality that involves a reflection on other people and their sins as a means of feeling a bit better oneself. He indeed thinks that that's what a lot of Christian morality encourages, noting how other people are just as bad as oneself, if not worse, and particularly looking for sensational tales that point out that some people are really bad sinners, whereas one is only guilty of the all-too-human. Nietzsche does not, perhaps surprisingly, urge us to go back to master morality. He thinks that's not psychologically possible. But what he does ask is that we move beyond good and evil, beyond simply viewing ourselves in light of how much we can vilify others. And that's where we're going to go on with this discussion next. Thank you.